Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I document places that stopped being places. That is the work, stated plainly. Towns that were abandoned when the resource ran out. Communities that dissolved when the industry left. Settlements that were absorbed into larger municipalities and lost their names in the process. I work for a state historical preservation office, and I spend my days building archival records for places that no longer exist, so that the fact of their having existed is not itself lost when the last person who remembers them is gone. I have been doing this for 11 years, and I am thorough and unsentimental about it in the specific way that the work requires, which is to say, I treat the absence of a place the same way I treat its presence, as a fact to be documented accurately and completely. I have processed 46 dissolved municipalities in 11 years. The cause of dissolution is always findable: economic collapse, natural disaster, resource exhaustion, the slow attrition of a community that lost its reason to exist and declined over decades until the last residents left and the county absorbed the land. Occasionally deliberate removal, a reservoir project, a highway corridor, an eminent domain action with a paper trail going back to the decision that started it. The cause is always in the record somewhere. You find the record and you document the cause and you file the history and you move to the next one. Crale did not have a cause in the record. Crale did not have much of anything in the record after a specific point, which is itself a kind of information once you know how to read it, and reading the shape of absences is most of what this job actually is. The assignment began with a land parcel. A county assessor's office, doing a routine audit, flagged a discrepancy in their internal ledger. A parcel listed as federally held, transferred from private ownership in 1973, with no corresponding documentation of the transfer in the public record, no deed transfer, no eminent domain filing, no acquisition notice. The parcel was in federal hands in the ledger, and the ledger did not say how it got there. The assessor's office contacted the preservation office because unexplained federal land holdings in rural counties sometimes have historical significance and sometimes have straightforward explanations that just hadn't been cross-referenced correctly, and they wanted someone to look before they decided which category this was. I pulled the parcel. The address on the original private ownership record corresponded to a street that did not appear on any current county map. I ran the street name through the state's historical records database and found 11 references to it, spread across documents from the 1950s through 1972. Utility service records, a property tax assessment, 2 mentions in what appeared to be a county planning document, 11 references to a street that existed for 2 decades and then stopped appearing in any document filed after 1972. One parcel became 312 when I pulled the full ledger page. 312 parcels transferred to federal holding in 1973, all in the same section of the county, all with the same absence of public documentation for the transfer. I requested the county plat maps for the relevant section. The plat books had pages missing, not torn out. removed before binding, cleanly, with the precision of pages that were taken out before the books were assembled and filed. The plat sequence had a gap corresponding to approximately the footprint of a small town, the numbers present on either side, and the intervening range simply absent. The books were filed in 1974. Pages removed before binding in 1974 means someone in 1974 knew the pages would need to not be there. The removal was anticipated. It was planned before the filing. Somebody sat down with those plat books before they went into the county archive and removed the pages for a specific section of land and filed the remainder and walked away. I sat with that for a while. Then I started building the record. I call it a negative space map, the archival practice of documenting an absence by cataloguing everything around it. If a town existed, it left traces in the surrounding documentary record in predictable ways. Tax records, school enrollment, utility service, church membership, newspaper coverage, the ordinary administrative presence of people living in a place. The traces are consistent and they are findable, and they describe the shape of a community, the way a shadow describes the shape of something blocking the light. Crale's shadow was present through 1972. Tax records showing 800 residents, a school with 412 enrolled students, utility service from the county's Rural Electric Cooperative, 2 churches with membership rolls that ran to the 1940s, a weekly newspaper, the Crale Courier, that had published continuously for 30 years, death records, birth records, marriage licenses, all filed at the county level in the ordinary rhythm of a town going about its existence. After 1972, the shadow stopped. Not gradually. That is the detail I kept returning to in the first weeks of building the map. Not a gradual trailing off, not the slow attrition of a community losing residents over years, not the pattern of economic decline that I have documented many times and that has a recognizable shape in the record. Simultaneous. Every record type absent from 1973 forward, as if a line had been drawn across the calendar and everything on one side of it had been gathered up and carried away. The newspaper was the thing I noted most carefully. 30 years of continuous, weekly publication. The Crale Courier existed in the county archive through December of 1972. The last edition I could find dated the 29th of that month. The first week of January 1973 had no edition. The second week had no edition. Every week after that had no edition. 30 years of a paper that had published through drought and economic difficulty and 2 wars, and then 1 week with no edition, and then permanent silence. There was no final edition, no announcement of closure, no note from the editor explaining that the paper was suspending publication. It simply did not publish again after December 29, 1972, in the same way that the street did not appear in any document filed after 1972, in the same way that 312 land parcels were in federal hands with no public record of how they got there. I noted in my working file, the removal was not erasure. The before record was intact. The after record was gone. Someone took the evidence of what Crale was after a specific point and left the evidence that it had existed at all. This was a specific kind of removal, the kind that says this place stopped, not the kind that says this place was never here. The distinction matters. It means the removal was honest about one thing. Crale existed. They just closed it. 800 people lived in Crale in 1971. They went somewhere. People don't disappear with the records of the place they lived. They move to new counties, file taxes in new states, appear in new records, die, and have their deaths recorded somewhere. I shifted from the town documents to the people and spent 3 weeks running names from the 1971 tax records against state and national databases. I found approximately a third of them. They appeared in records from other Midwestern states beginning in 1973 and 1974, listed at new addresses, the prior address history in some cases showing a gap and in others showing a previous address that was not Crale. The gap or the substitution consistent across records suggesting the relocations had been managed in a coordinated way. I found addresses for a handful and I wrote letters. Most came back undeliverable. 2 did not. One response came from a woman named Dot. She was in her 80s, living in a small city in a neighboring state, and her letter was 3 paragraphs in a careful hand on plain stationery. She confirmed she had lived in Crale and left in the spring of 1973. She said the leaving had not been difficult in the practical sense because the assistance offered had been genuinely sufficient, which was a careful way of putting it, and one I read more than once. She described a man who came to Crale and spoke to residents individually and in small groups over the course of several weeks. Calm, polite, clear about what was being asked. The land had a problem. The problem was being addressed by the federal government. Everyone would receive assistance relocating, and the assistance would be adequate. Most people left without significant resistance because the man was credible and the assistance was real, and because a calm official presence offering genuine help in a rural community in 1973 was persuasive in a way that coercion would not have needed to be. She wrote that before she left, she asked the man what the problem with the land was. He told her the land had something in it that the government needed to understand better before anyone could safely live above it. She asked what was in it. He said he wasn't able to tell her that, and she wrote, with 50 years of distance behind the observation, that he said it in the tone of someone who genuinely could not, rather than someone who was declining to. The distinction had stayed with her. She wrote, "I always thought it was something from the war. Things got buried in places during the war years, and some of it turned up later and caused problems. I assumed it was that, and the assumption satisfied me for a long time." She wrote, "I don't think it was that anymore." She did not say what she thought it was. The letter ended there, thanked me for my interest in the history of the town, and wished me well with the research. I have read that letter many times. The last 2 sentences sit with a weight that I think she intended, and that I think she earned across 50 years of thinking about a question she had been given no answer to. Federal records require careful handling professionally. Arriving at a claim of federal agency involvement in a local matter without sufficient documentary basis is the kind of move that ends a researcher's institutional credibility, and I have spent 11 years building that credibility, and I was not going to shortcut the process. I spent 6 weeks building the documentary basis before I filed anything. The Freedom of Information request went to the Federal Land Management Office. The response came 12 weeks later, 64 pages, approximately 40% redacted. What remained visible confirmed the acquisition of 312 parcels in 1973, transferred under a program designation that appeared 11 times in the documents as a 5-character alphanumeric code. I could not find the program designation in any public record of federal land management programs from that period. I contacted a colleague at a university, a historian who had spent his career on Cold War federal land use and who knew that archive better than anyone I could reach. He had not seen the designation. He said this was not necessarily significant, that many program designations from that period were never publicly documented outside classified records. He asked what the acquisition was for. I told him it was redacted. He asked where the land was. I told him the county. He was quiet for a moment. He said the county was not near any known facility that would account for a federal acquisition of that size in that period. No military base, no research installation, no infrastructure project. The size of the acquisition and the period and the location were unusual in combination in a way that didn't fit the patterns he knew. I asked him whether he could think of any program from that period that would relocate an entire town's population as a precautionary measure without disclosing the reason. He said yes. He said several. He said the ones with full population relocation and record suppression were generally the ones where the contamination category was internally contested, where the government's own people disagreed about what the thing in the ground was. He said contested how? He said categorically, where one team said one kind of problem and another team said a different kind of problem, and the disagreement was significant enough that the classification level went up rather than down, because classifying it meant not having to resolve the disagreement in public. I thanked him and filed the information in my working notes and drove to the county on a personal day. The land where Crale was is flat and unremarkable. I found the approximate location from the plat gaps and the surrounding township records and drove the county roads until the geometry of what I had mapped put me in the right general area. There was nothing to see. No foundations, no remnant structures, no depression in the ground where a basement had been. Ghost towns leave physical evidence. Even deliberately cleared towns leave something in the soil. The altered composition of ground that has been built on and gardened and compacted under foot traffic for decades. The ground here had been worked over thoroughly enough that whatever traces the town had left in the soil were not visible. The field was farmed right up to a point and then stopped. Not a fence line, not a natural boundary. A line, roughly following what the plat geometry suggested was the southern edge of Crale's main settled area, past which the land was not farmed. Not obviously different from the farmed section. Not fallow in the way of a field resting between seasons. Just not farmed. The agricultural residue present on both sides of the line, and the line itself invisible, except through what wasn't happening on the northern side of it. The farmer at the edge of the worked section stopped when I flagged him down. He said his family had farmed the land since buying it from the federal holding in the 1980s, and they had always left the north section alone. I asked why. He said his father left it alone and he left it alone. I asked if his father had said why. He looked at the north section for a moment. He said his father had tried it the first year and said afterward, that the ground felt wrong under the equipment and that he wasn't going to try it again. I asked what wrong meant. He said he didn't know exactly. He said his father wasn't a man who used that kind of language often, and when he did, he meant it. I thanked him and drove back to the city and added the conversation to the oral history addendum in my working file. The response came from an office I had not contacted. I had filed the FOIA request with the Federal Land Management Office. The response, 12 weeks later, came from a sub-office designation within a larger federal department that I could not find in any public directory of federal offices. The cover letter was professionally courteous and enclosed a single document, 8 pages, 6 of them redacted in full. The document was a geological survey report dated 1972, commissioned for the parcels that would become the Crale acquisition. The 2 unredacted pages were the preliminary findings section, the front matter before whatever the body of the report described, standard geological language, flat and professional, soil composition and bedrock depth and regional comparison, the kind of language that describes ordinary ground in ordinary ways. The last paragraph of the unredacted section was not flat. I have read it enough times to reproduce it exactly. It reads, "Survey team identified an anomaly in the lower strata beginning at approximately 40 feet depth and extending to an undetermined lower boundary. The anomaly does not correspond to any geological formation in the regional survey record. Composition analysis is ongoing. Preliminary assessment is that the anomaly is not geological in origin. Full findings in the restricted section of this report." Not geological in origin. I sat with that sentence for a long time. I thought about 800 people living above 40 feet of something the government's own survey team had determined was not geological. I thought about the polite man who came to Crale in the spring of 1973 and told Dot the land had a problem that needed to be understood before anyone could safely live above it. I thought about him saying he genuinely could not tell her what the problem was, not declining, but actually unable, which meant the people doing the asking had not been told the answer either. I thought about the farmer's father, who tried the north section once and said the ground felt wrong under the equipment and never tried it again. I thought about who had decided to send me the first 2 pages. The cover letter included a contact name and a phone number. Someone at an office I could not find in a public directory had reviewed my FOIA request and sent me a partial geological survey report from 1972. They had sent me exactly enough to know that something was there, and exactly not enough to know what it was. That was a decision. Someone made it. They made it in response to my request, and they made it deliberately. And I have been trying to determine what the decision was intended to do ever since. The archival record for Crale is 37 pages. The negative space map covers the documentary evidence of the town's existence before 1973 and the shape of the removal after it. Dot's letter is included in full. The farmer's account is in the oral history addendum. The partial geological survey is included with the unredacted sections reproduced and the redacted pages noted by count. The dissolution cause field required a decision. I have filled it in 46 times without difficulty. I typed Federal Acquisition, 1973. Cause of acquisition, undisclosed. It is the first time in 11 years I have used that word in that field. The restricted section of the geological survey is accessible through the FOIA process. I have the contact name and the phone number. The request pathway is clear and I know how to use it, and the restricted section is the answer to the question that the unredacted pages opened. It would tell me what the composition analysis found. It would tell me what was in the lower strata below Crale's 40-foot mark. It might tell me whether the undetermined lower boundary was ever determined. I have not requested it. I have been sitting with the reason and working out whether the reason is sound. The reason is not institutional caution, and it is not procedural hesitation. The reason is that the partial survey was sent to me by someone who had the full survey and chose to send me the first 2 pages, and that choice was itself information. Someone decided there was a version of what I was looking for that I should have and a version I should not, and they made that distinction deliberately. And I have spent enough time in archival work to understand that the people closest to a record are often the best positioned to judge what the record does when it travels. I think about Dot's letter. She had 50 years to develop an opinion about what was in the ground below her town, and she did not write it down. She wrote that she no longer thought it was what she used to think it was, and she stopped there. I think she stopped there for the same reason the polite man was genuinely unable to tell her rather than choosing not to. Some information is not withheld because the person withholding it is protecting something. Some information is withheld because the person withholding it has determined that passing it along does something, and they are not certain that something is an improvement. The land is still federally held. I checked before I filed the record. The holding designation has been renewed every decade since 1973. The same 5-character program code each time, quiet and routine. The designation appearing in internal ledgers and nowhere else. Whatever is 40 feet below that field has been 40 feet below it through all of it, through the town built above it, and the town removed, and the land cleared, and the field farmed right up to the line where the farmer's father tried once and stopped. Through 50 years of federal holding and renewed designations, and a geological survey with 6 redacted pages sitting in a restricted file somewhere. The preliminary assessment said not geological in origin. It said the lower boundary was undetermined. They removed 800 people from above it without knowing how far down it went. They may know now. The restricted pages may say, I don't know, and I have decided with more deliberateness than I usually bring to archival decisions that I am going to leave the not knowing in place. The record is complete. The center of it is empty, and the center being empty is itself documented in the dissolution cause field and in the note I added to the record summary. Nature of federal acquisition remains classified. Geological survey conducted 1972 indicates anomalous subsurface feature of undetermined composition and undetermined depth. Full findings restricted. I filed it. I moved to the next assignment. A town in the southern part of the state flooded by a reservoir project in 1961. Well documented. A clean dissolution with a cause that fits in the field without difficulty. I am most of the way through the record. It is straightforward work, and I am glad for it. The contact number from the cover letter is in my files. I have not called it. The lower boundary was undetermined in 1972. The thing below Crale's 40 feet has been there since before the county existed, since before anyone arrived in that part of the country to build things above it or survey what was underneath. It has been there through all of it, and it will be there through whatever comes next, sitting below a flat, unremarkable field in a Midwestern county that a farmer's family has worked for 40 years, without touching the north section. The ground felt wrong under the equipment. I believe him. I believe his father. I believe the survey team who found something and wrote 6 pages about it that have been restricted for 50 years. I don't need to know what they wrote. I have the shape of the absence. I have documented it completely. The shape is enough. I close the file. I do not call the number.